Hi, this is Stuart Weems and welcome to the Investopoly podcast. My goal is to give you simple, easy to understand strategies, insights and tips to help you master the game of building wealth. And in this episode, I'd like to talk about what the RBA has done wrong because I think it's made some big mistakes. And if Australia slips into a recession, which is entirely possible, it's almost entirely because of the RBA and how they've handled the removal of pandemic measures. And I think they've completely botched it, and to the detriment of borrowers, the economy, and the bond market. And that's what I want to talk about today. So firstly, in the RBA's defence, there's two things that I would say. The first one is that they've had to navigate, uncharted territory over the last 2.5 years. Obviously, there's been a lot of uncertainty with a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And really at the beginning, no one really knew, the duration of lockdowns, how long would have to be locked down for, and also whether the pharma companies would ever be able to come up with a vaccine and how quickly it would take them to come up with a vaccine. So those two things, and then also how severe the actual virus was in terms of mortality rate and so forth. So there was a lot of uncertainty at the beginning of the pandemic, and there wasn't any real rule book in which the RBA could, measure decisions or help make decisions. So I guess that's the first thing, is to acknowledge that they were kind of flying blind a little bit. The second thing I should acknowledge is what they did do, they did very quickly, and the measures they put in place, I think, were well thought out and appropriate. So the initial reaction to the pandemic, I think, was excellent. And they did three things, really, the RBA did. The first one is they slashed the cash rate almost to zero, ostensibly to zero. It got down to 0.1%. They made a very large 0.75% cut in March, and then another 15 points in November. So they brought the cash rate down very quickly. The second thing they did is announce what they call a term funding facility, which essentially lent the banks money fixed at a fixed interest rate for 3 years, and that interest rate was equal to the cash rate, the prevailing cash rate. So for most of that time, they were lending to the banks at 0.1% fixed for 3 years, and that allowed the banks then to on-lend that money to borrowers at very cheap fixed rates. At some points towards the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021, 2 and 3 year fixed rates were below 2%. And that gave borrowers some level of certainty and then also improved their personal cash flow, particularly for people that, had their income impacted by lockdowns and so forth. That was very valuable. And the last thing they did is what's called yield curve control, which means that they manipulated the bond market so that the 3-year bond rate was equal to the cash rate, which means that we had a very flat interest rate curve. And the benefit of that is that it kept borrowing costs low for corporates, because often business loans are benchmarked to those sorts of rates. So that all those three measures were implemented very quickly, and they were very important and I think very effective. But what it did wrong is I think it made really three critical mistakes, which we are, as an economy, paying for right now. The first one is that the RBA governor, Philip Lowe, adopted the unusual practice of giving forward interest rate guidance. So that is that he was quite open to saying to the public that the RBA doesn't expect to raise rates until 2024. Which is unusual because normally central banks, including the RBA, don't like to participate or impact a market or manipulate a market, because obviously the market's going to put a lot of weight on their comments, and whilst they're kind of the market makers, if you like, it's not necessarily a good idea for a central bank to start giving guidance, because they really then do affect the market, and you're actually better off to let the free market sort it out. Now, of course, Philip Lowe said, look, our predication of not raising interest rates until 2024 was based on our expectations and projections, economic projections, which didn't include much higher inflation at the time. So, of course, they were conditional, but the point is that he would have been better off remaining silent and not, as it's turned out, given the market incorrect indications in terms of what they expected to do. The second mistake is that they left the cash rate too low for too long. I think it was really obvious by at least the first half of 2021 that the Australian economy was very resilient, that lockdowns did cause some economic pain. Consumer spending did drop during periods of time when states were in lockdown. But as soon as those lockdowns were lifted, consumer spending bounced back very quickly. And whilst the unemployment rate did increase, of course, it certainly didn't get out of control. Now, because the RBA left it a little bit too late, they've got to be a bit more aggressive, and they've raised rates by 1.75% in only the last 4 months. There's only one time in history that they've been a little bit more aggressive than that. Back in 1994, they raised rates by 2.75% over 5 months. So it doesn't really matter. The point is that they've had to be super aggressive now, which comes with some risk. And finally, the final mistake, and perhaps one of the really big ones, was that they abandoned yield curve control, which almost sort of crashed the bond market. So when the RBA first initiated the yield control when the pandemic broke, what they had to do is go out and buy as many government bonds as they could to reduce the yield down to the cash rate. Obviously, just basic laws of supply and demand. If there's strong demand, price drops, and therefore the interest rate comes down. It only actually took them 11 days to achieve that, and they had to buy $27 billion of bonds, which sounds like a lot, but really isn't that significant. Once they got the 3-year government bond rate down to equal the cash rate, there's very little intervention they had to make, because it was clear to the market that whatever the bond yield was going to do by itself, the RBA was going to interfere. So really there wasn't a lot of interference in the market. In mid-2021, they announced that they'd start winding back yield curve control. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful. But they completely abandoned it almost without any warning in October 2021. And between September and November 2021, the 3-year bond rate increased by tenfold. So it jumped from 0.1% to over 1%. It did most of that increase in only a couple of weeks. And that caused bond values to crash and really created some problems. I think they could have done that a lot better. Now, of course, we talk about the RBA hiking interest rates so aggressively. But we also know that in other developed countries, they've been hiking rates too. My point, though, is that other countries are very different to Australia. So the US Federal Reserve this year has hiked rates by 2.25%, which is significant, and Bank of England by 1.5%. But these are different countries. Inflation readings are higher. In the US, inflation's 9.1%. In the UK, 9.4%, compared to Australia, which is 6.1%. Also, importantly, in the US, wage inflation is twice as high as what it is in Australia, at 5.4% versus 2.4% here in Australia. And when you have higher wage inflation and higher prices, that's a problem because people have more income to sustain those higher prices. So it's something that they need to jump on relatively quickly. So if it's a defence that, look, other countries are hiking rates aggressively too, yes, part of that, the reasons are global, but also it really is a country-by-country sort of specific response. Now I'm going to get to what I think the RBA should have done to improve the interest rate management. I think it's important to point out that I think the RBA's really ruined any prospect of achieving some decent wage inflation. So prior to the pandemic, the RBA was on a course of gradually cutting the cash rate to stimulate the economy to hopefully, in turn, stimulate wage inflation. And there's a lot of commentary around why wage inflation has been low, not only in Australia, but also globally. And I don't think really there's one particular thing. And certainly there's been no agreement across the board in terms of commentators of why that is. So I guess we're left sort of scratching our heads to some extent. But for what it's worth, my best guess is the reason wages haven't been increasing is twofold: globalization of the workforce and technology. So globalization of the workforce means that Australian businesses, large or small, can go and hire offshore staff at significantly lower costs. And that doesn't impact every industry, occupation or role. It certainly has an impact for Australian wages, and so that's something that's sort of been playing through over the last couple of years. And then obviously technology assists in terms of achieving greater efficiency through automation and those sorts of things. Again, that can have an impact on headcount, because if I've got a way to automate business processes, then I need fewer staff in order to run my business. I think if the pandemic's taught us one thing, it's that lots of people can do their job almost just as well working from home, or in fact any location. So I think the pandemic will probably make workforce globalization worse, not better, in terms of its impact on wage inflation. But again, this whole working from home thing still hasn't played out well enough, because employers are reluctant to require people to come back in the office, particularly while the government, state and federal, suggesting that people should be working from home. In that environment where you've got a government that's interfering and providing that sort of guidance, employers will be reluctant to demand staff to return to work. So what we really need in terms of to be able to assess whether this the impact of this work from home thing is the government needs to keep out of it eventually, when the health advice is appropriate, and then we'll really see what employers really want their staff to do, and I suspect it's to come back into the office. So because the RBA left hiking rates too late, and now that they've had to hike rates very aggressively, I think the chance of achieving sustainable economic growth that then translates to sustainable wage inflation, I think that's much further away than what it was at the beginning of the pandemic. So really, in a way, these mistakes that the RBA's made, the three mistakes that I just went through, have really come at the cost of all the hard work that they were doing pre-pandemic to create some sustainable wage inflation. Okay, so what should have the RBA done? Well, of course, I'm not the governor of the RBA, and I acknowledge that we all make mistakes, but looking back, what could have the RBA done better? Well, firstly, I think they should have stuck to their historic policy of not providing any interest rate guidance. It's what central banks have been doing for decades. And in fact, it reminds me of Alan Greenspan, who was the previous Federal Reserve Chairman, once famously said, "If you understand what I'm saying, you don't understand what I'm saying." Because he would purposely try and bamboozle his audience by saying a whole lot, but at the same time saying nothing, which I think is kind of humorous. And that's what Governor Lowe should have done. The same thing, to kind of avoid the irresponsibility of inviting Australians to believe that interest rates wouldn't change to 2024. The reality is that they didn't have a strong enough position to be able to make that prediction actually true. And then now they find themselves in a situation that they're hiking rates so aggressively. It's almost misleading, really. The second thing they should have done is at some time during 2021, probably mid-2021, once it became obvious that the economy was doing well, there was actually no basis for ostensibly zero interest rates. And what they could have done then is gradually start increasing the cash rate, maybe only by 0.1 or 0.15% each month, but just gradually easing that interest rate back up. That would have provided the market to sort of get its head around, higher interest rates rather than hiking them substantially in a very small pace of time. It would have also allowed them to measure the impact of higher interest rates on the economy. So they could have kept hiking them as long as the economy wasn't suffering too much. And that would have been a nice gentle way to do that. And finally, and maybe most importantly, they could have dealt with the yield curve control thing a lot better. Instead of virtually banning it overnight, they could have gradually sort of reduced their policy of yield curve control. If the RBA is prepared to intervene and manipulate a market and manipulate the 3-year bond yield, then it has the responsibility to remove that intervention in a way that minimises market disruption, and it certainly didn't do that. So it's almost perfect timing then that Federal Treasurer Chalmers has announced a review of the RBA that will report to the government by March 2023, March next year. Of course, both sides of politics had that as an election promise in terms of the RBA review. It's widely expected that the next board governor will be an external appointment. Really, historically, it's normally been an internal appointment. And there's some commentary around whether that's appropriate given the culture within the RBA. The other thing that's been bandied about is that the composition of the board might change, have more economists and academics and fewer business people on the board. So there's some of the things that I guess some commentators have thought might be the outcome of the review, but it's going to be really interesting to see what the recommendations will be. But I don't think Philip Lowe is going to stick around beyond his contract, which finishes in September 2023. Okay, so to wrap up, really the RBA's initial response to the pandemic is really hard to criticise. It acted swiftly, its initiatives really helped Australians through what was a really difficult and uncertain time, and really preserved the health of the underlying economy at the time. However, its removal of those pandemic support measures couldn't have been more different. Unfortunately, its actions, or maybe lack thereof, will cause some economic pain. Although it's likely to be temporary, it's possible that Australia will now slip into recession because of how aggressively they've increased interest rates to try and attack inflation that's mostly supply side driven anyway, rather than demand side driven. And so it's probably going to be ineffective. But the RBA review, I think, is perfectly timed because at least I think we might be able to learn something from what they've done to hopefully not repeat those same mistakes. Okay, that's it from me for this week. Until next week, bye for now.